You won't believe how far some people will go to control what doesn't even belong to them. Imagine moving into your dream home, finally free from the constant rules and drama of an hoe, only to have a neighbor who isn't even connected to your property suddenly decide she owns the right to your life. That's exactly what happened to me. Out of nowhere, this self-appointed HOA Karen came knocking, insisting that my house belonged to her hoe, even though it never did. At first, I thought it was just a harmless mistake. But then the letters started coming, followed by fines, and eventually she filed a lawsuit claiming I had no right to live outside her HOA's control. The whole thing was ridiculous, but it was also exhausting. She acted like she was the law, when in reality, she had no legal power over me or my home. Still, facing a lawsuit isn't something anyone wants to deal with, and for a while, I wondered if this was going to turn into an endless battle. She was confident, almost smug, like she had me trapped, and there was nothing I could do. But what she didn't know was that I had a plan. See, the truth was, her hoe had been bending the rules for years. And once I started digging deeper, I uncovered something so big it didn't just free me, it put the entire hoe on shaky ground. What started as her attempt to control me ended with me discovering a legal loophole that could shut them down completely. So how did a lawsuit meant to scare me end up destroying her hoe instead? Stick around, because that's where things get very interesting. When the lawsuit papers landed on my doorstep, I realized this wasn't just some petty neighborly argument anymore, it was war. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the hoe, was determined to prove she had control over me and my home. She paraded around the neighborhood, bragging about how she was going to make an example out of me. What she didn't expect was that her arrogance would eventually expose all the cracks in the very hoe she thought was untouchable. I started piecing together the history of the community, and the more I uncovered, the more things didn't add up. This hoe had expanded its power far beyond what was written in the original deed restrictions. They had quietly absorbed properties that were never part of the association, charging homeowners outrageous fees and threatening them with lawsuits if they resisted. I wasn't the first person they tried this with, I was just the first one willing to push back hard. Neighbors began sharing their stories once they saw I was fighting back. People told me about years of intimidation, random fines for things as small as the color of their mailbox, and even threats of foreclosure over unpaid fees that were never legally valid in the first place. Karen, of course, was at the center of it all. She thrived on fear and control, and many people had stayed silent because they didn't think they had a choice. But now that I was digging deeper, things were shifting. I found old legal documents, maps, and property lines that clearly showed my house, and several others, had never been under the HOA's authority. That was the key. But if I was right, it meant Karen's lawsuit wasn't just baseless, it could unravel the entire hoe. The question was, would I have the courage to use it? The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about me. Karen's obsession with control had created a culture of fear in the neighborhood. People avoided eye contact when she walked by, and families whispered about fines and threats like it was some unspoken rule of survival. The hoe wasn't functioning as a community anymore, it was functioning as Karen's personal empire. And with the lawsuit against me, she thought she was cementing her power once and for all. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. A few neighbors quietly approached me, slipping me copies of old hoe notices or telling me about meetings where decisions were made without votes. Some even admitted they had paid fines just to avoid conflict, even though they suspected those fines weren't enforceable. These stories fueled me, but they also added pressure. If I was wrong, I'd be standing alone against a well-funded hoe with lawyers on speed dial. If I was right, though, Karen was about to lose everything she built her reputation on. At the same time, the personal toll started creeping in. I found myself double-checking locks, second-guessing conversations, and constantly watching for retaliation. Karen had a way of making even small interactions feel threatening. One day, I caught her photographing my yard from the sidewalk, scribbling notes like she was building a case for something else. It wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was psychological warfare. The conflict wasn't only legal. It was emotional and social. Neighbors were torn between staying quiet or standing up. Families who had lived there for years were scared to take sides, knowing Karen had a long memory and a louder voice. And through it all, I kept asking myself the same question. If I pushed this too far, what would she do next? The court date was set, and every passing day felt like a countdown to a showdown I couldn't avoid. Karen strutted around the neighborhood with even more confidence, telling anyone who would listen that she was about to put me in my place. It wasn't just words. She made sure the lawsuit papers were talked about at every home meeting, painting me as some kind of outsider trying to destroy their community. The irony was, my home had never been under their hoe in the first place. Still, the more she spread her story, the more the pressure built. In the evenings, I would sit at my desk surrounded by stacks of documents, property deeds, plats, county records, trying to piece together the puzzle. Each new paper I uncovered felt like one step closer to the truth, but also one step closer to a confrontation that would shake everything. The evidence was there, but the question was whether anyone would believe it once Karen twisted her side of the story. Neighbors were caught in the middle. A few whispered words of encouragement, but most kept their distance, too scared of Karen's wrath if they were seen supporting me. It created a strange, heavy silence in the neighborhood, like everyone was waiting for an explosion they couldn't stop. At the same time, Karen became more aggressive. She sent more letters, threatened more fines, and even warned some of my neighbors that siding with me would cost them. By the time the court date drew near, the tension was unbearable. I had uncovered something big, something that didn't just protect me, but could dismantle the hoe itself. Karen thought she was tightening the noose, but she had no idea she was walking straight into her own trap. The stage was set, and there was no turning back. The morning of the hearing felt heavier than any day before. I woke up before the sun, unable to shake the knot in my stomach. My desk was still scattered with highlighted documents and printed maps, each one a piece of the puzzle I hoped would prove Karen wrong. But even with all that evidence, doubts lingered. What if the judge didn't see it my way? What if Karen's lawyers twisted things enough to confuse the case? The thought of losing, of being forced under hoe control, weighed on me like a brick. As I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, I noticed Karen already there, standing with her usual smug smile and a small group of hoe board members. They looked like they were attending a victory parade instead of a legal hearing. Karen even waved at me, not as a neighbor, but as someone convinced she had already won. That gesture alone nearly pushed me over the edge, but I kept calm. I knew I had something she didn't, a truth buried in the very foundation of the neighborhood's history. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. Karen spoke loudly in the hallway, making sure everyone could hear her predictions about how easy the case would be. A few neighbors showed up too, pretending to be there out of curiosity, but I could tell they were holding their breath, waiting to see which way things would go. As the minutes ticked down, I sat in silence, clutching the folder of evidence that could change everything. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about exposing years of overreach and intimidation. Karen thought today was about me, but deep down I knew this was about to be the day her entire whole empire faced the truth. When the judge finally called our case, the entire room seemed to lean forward. Karen's attorney went first, presenting the HOA's argument with complete confidence. He painted a picture of me as a rogue homeowner trying to dodge responsibility, insisting my property had always been under their authority. Karen nodded proudly with every word, certain that victory was only minutes away. Then it was my turn. My hands shook slightly as I opened my folder, but once I started laying out the evidence, the room shifted. I presented the original plats filed with the county, pointing to the boundary lines that clearly excluded my property and several others. I showed old deed restrictions, proving they applied only to a specific section of the neighborhood. Finally, I revealed meeting minutes where the hoe board had knowingly discussed absorbing extra homes without consent. For the first time, Karen's smile faltered. The judge studied the documents carefully, asking pointed questions. Every answer tightened the case against the hoe. The courtroom grew silent, except for the sound of pages turning and Karen whispering furiously to her attorney. And then, the words I'd been waiting for came. The judge declared the lawsuit invalid, ruling that my property was never part of the hoe and that their attempt to enforce control was unlawful. Relief washed over me, but then came the twist. The judge didn't stop there. Based on the evidence of overreach, he ordered a deeper review of the HOA's actions, which could threaten its very existence. Karen hadn't just lost against me, she had put her entire HOA under investigation. As I walked out of the courtroom, Karen stood frozen, her empire crumbling. What began as her lawsuit to control me had become the very thing that might destroy her HOA for good. Walking out of that courthouse, I finally felt the weight lift off my shoulders. For months I had lived under the shadow of this HOA battle, but now the truth was official. I was free. My home was never part of the HOA, and no amount of intimidation or paperwork from Karen could ever change that. The look on her face said it all. She had gone in certain of victory, and instead, she walked out with her reputation in pieces and her HOA under investigation. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects spread quickly. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Stories poured out about unfair fines, shady financial practices, and years of being bullied into compliance. For the first time, people realized they weren't alone, and that Karen's control wasn't as unshakable as she made it seem. Some even reached out to thank me, admitting they wished they had fought back sooner. As for me, I returned to something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I could enjoy my own property without the constant worry of letters, fines, or threats. The yard was no longer a battlefield, and the street felt lighter without Karen marching up and down trying to enforce rules that never applied. The biggest lesson I took away from all of this is that knowledge is power. HOAs can serve a purpose, but when leaders misuse their authority, it can destroy the very sense of community they claim to protect. Standing up to them isn't easy, but it can make all the difference. In the end, Karen's lawsuit backfired. She tried to take away my freedom, but instead, she lost control of everything she had built. And honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better ending.